I fired her to save a multi-million-dollar deal. It was a cold, calculated executive decision. Or so I told myself. But when she walked back into that ballroom 2 weeks later, wearing a dress that stopped the room, I realized two things. I had made the biggest mistake of my career, and the young analyst I dismissed was the only one holding the keys to my salvation. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a boardroom when a deal is dying. It isn't peaceful. It's heavy. It presses against your eardrums like deep water. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, my hands clasped in front of me, watching the faces of the investors turn from curious to hostile. The numbers had leaked. Someone had talked. And in a room full of sharks, blood in the water means you have to throw someone overboard to keep the rest of the boat afloat. My eyes swept the room, landing on Clara. She was sitting at the far end of the table, her posture perfect, a notepad open in front of her. 24 years old. The youngest person in the room by 2 decades. In the sterile gray world of high finance, she was a burst of color, sharp, eager, and terrifyingly observant. I had hired her because she saw patterns where I saw only chaos. But today her youth made her a target. The leak came from the analysis team, one of the partners said, his voice dripping with accusation. He didn't say her name, but he didn't have to. Every head turned toward the girl in the navy blazer. I knew logically it probably wasn't her. Clara was loyal to a fault. But logic doesn't stop a feeding frenzy. I needed to regain control. I needed to show strength. I cleared my throat. The sound was like a gavel striking wood. Clara, I said. My voice was steady, the voice of a man who has made 1,000 difficult decisions and lost sleep over none of them. Pack your things. She froze. The pen she was holding hovered just above the paper. For a second, the only sound was the low, aggressive hum of the air conditioning unit. She looked up, meeting my gaze down the length of the long table. I expected to see fear. I expected the glossy sheen of tears that usually comes when a junior staff member is crushed by the corporate machine. But I didn't see fear. I saw disappointment. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply capped her pen. Click. That sound, that tiny insignificant click of plastic, echoed in the room louder than a shout. It felt final. Felt like a severing. She stood up, gathering her files with a dignity that made the older men in the room shift uncomfortably in their expensive chairs. She smoothed the front of her skirt, looked at me one last time, searching for something behind my eyes, perhaps a trace of the mentor she thought she knew, and found nothing but stone. "Understood, sir," she said softly. She walked to the heavy oak door. The rhythm of her heels on the parquet floor was steady. Click, click, click. Then the door opened and closed with a soft thud. The air in the room seemed to rush out with her. "Right," I said, turning back to the investors, my chest feeling strangely hollow. "Now that the distraction is removed, let's discuss the recovery strategy." They nodded, satisfied. The sacrifice had been accepted. I had saved the deal. I was the capable, ruthless CEO they paid me to be. But as I looked down at my own notes, the words blurred. The scent of her, something faint like vanilla and rain, seemed to linger in the stale air of the office. My hands were still clasped, still steady, but deep in my gut, a cold knot was forming. I had just made the most logical move of my career. So why did I feel like I had just lost the only thing in this building that actually mattered? 2 weeks. 14 days. That's how long it takes for a bustling corporate headquarters to forget a person ever existed. Or at least that's how long it usually takes. It was 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. The city below my floor-to-ceiling windows was nothing but a grid of amber and white lights, moving in that endless hypnotic rhythm of urban life. Inside the office was a tomb. The cleaning crews had already come and gone, leaving the carpets with those perfect, uniform vacuum lines that always felt unnervingly artificial. I was sitting at my desk, the glow of 3 monitors bathing my face in a harsh blue light. The deal, the one I had sacrificed Clara to save, was still bleeding out. The leak hadn't stopped. In fact, without her there to organize the data streams, the hemorrhage had gotten worse. I rubbed my temples, the onset of a migraine tightening like a vice behind my eyes. I needed coffee. I walked to the break room, the sound of my dress shoes absorbing into the plush carpet. The motion sensor lights flickered on with a clinical buzz. I opened the refrigerator, reaching for my usual black cold brew, and my hand froze. There, pushed to the back of the shelf, was a bottle of vanilla almond creamer. It was such a stupid, trivial thing. A plastic bottle with a bright blue cap. But it hit me with the force of a physical blow. I could suddenly smell it, that sweet, warm scent that used to drift from her cubicle every morning at 8:15 a.m. sharp. It was a scent I used to find distracting. Now, standing in the cold, fluorescent light of the kitchen, the absence of that smell felt like a lack of oxygen. I closed the fridge door without taking anything. I couldn't be in there. Back in my office, I started tearing through the stacks of paper on my desk, looking for a quarterly report. I shoved a pile of legal pads aside, and a thin, spiral-bound notebook slid out and hit the floor. It wasn't mine. The cover was a soft, worn leather, Clara's. She must have left it behind in the chaos of her departure. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I picked it up. The leather was still smooth, warm to the touch, or maybe I was just imagining the warmth of her hands on it. I opened it to the last page she had written on, the date marked, the day of the meeting. Her handwriting was looped and hurried, but the logic was razor-sharp. The leak isn't external, she had written in red ink. Check the metadata on the partner's shared drive. Timestamps don't match the server logs. It's coming from inside the C-suite. I stared at the words. My breath hitched in my throat. She knew. She had known before I even called the meeting. She hadn't just been doing her job. She had been protecting mine. She had traced the betrayal to my own level, likely to a man I had shaken hands with for 10 years, and instead of listening to her, I had silenced her. I sank back into my leather chair, the notebook resting heavy in my hands. The office felt vast, cavernous, and incredibly cold. For years, I had convinced myself that this solitude was power, that being the man at the top meant being the man alone. But looking at her messy, brilliant notes, I realized I wasn't just alone. I was wrong. I ran my thumb over the edge of the page, imagining the way she would have sat there, biting her lip as she connected the dots, waiting for me to ask her what she thought. But I never asked. The silence of the room wasn't peaceful anymore. It was an accusation. And for the first time in a decade, the view from the top didn't look like success. It looked like a mistake. The annual Investors Gala is a battlefield disguised as a cocktail party. It smells of expensive perfume, stale champagne, and desperation. I stood near a pillar of white marble, swirling the ice in my glass, feeling the walls closing in. The deal was dead. My partner, Marcus, the man I had trusted while I cast Clara aside, was standing 10 feet away, holding court with the rival firm. He was smiling. The kind of smile a man wears when he knows he's won, and the carcass has already been divided. I adjusted my cufflinks, preparing my concession speech in my head. I was the captain going down with the ship. Then the room changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a shift in the air pressure. The low murmur of conversation near the entrance didn't just stop. It evaporated. Heads turned. Not quickly, but with that slow magnetic pull that happens when something undeniable enters a room. I followed their gaze. And for the second time in 2 weeks, I forgot how to breathe. It was Clara. But it wasn't the girl in the navy blazer and sensible heels I had fired. The woman walking down the grand staircase was a stranger. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her frame like water, moving with a fluid, terrifying elegance. Her hair, usually pulled back in a chaotic bun, was cascading over one shoulder. She looked powerful. She didn't look for the exit. She didn't look for a waiter. Her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and fiercely calm, locked onto mine across 50 feet of crowded ballroom. She began to walk toward me. The crowd parted. Men who hadn't looked at her twice in the boardroom were now stepping aside, straightening their ties as she passed. The rhythmic click-click-click of her heels on the marble floor cut through the string quartet's melody like a metronome counting down to an explosion. She stopped in front of me. Up close, I could see the faint dusting of freckles I had never noticed before, and the way her pulse fluttered just beneath the skin of her throat. She smelled of vanilla, yes, but also something darker now. Sandalwood. Confidence. "You look like you're about to surrender, Julian," she said. Her voice was low, intimate. It was the first time she had ever used my first name. It sent a shock of heat straight down my spine. "Clara," I managed, my voice rougher than I intended. "What are you doing here?" "Finishing the job," she whispered. She didn't reach for a drink. Instead, She reached into her clutch and pulled out a slim cream-colored envelope. She held it out to me, her fingers brushing against my palm as I took it. Her skin was warm, electric against the cold dampness of my hand. "The metadata," she said, her eyes never leaving mine. "Marcus has been feeding the rival firm for 6 months. The timestamps are in there. The bank transfers are in there. It wasn't a leak, Julian. It was a sale." I gripped the envelope, staring at her. She had done this alone. Without resources. Without a salary. Without me. She stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that felt entirely permissible. She leaned up, her lips hovering inches from my ear, ostensibly to be heard over the music, but the gesture felt like a secret. "Go destroy him," she murmured, the warmth of her breath ghosting over my neck. "And then take me to dinner." She pulled back, offering me a small, devastating smile and turned to walk away. I stood there, the evidence that would save my career burning a hole in my hand. But as I watched her walk through the crowd, I realized I didn't care about the deal anymore. I just wanted to know who this woman was, and how I could possibly spend the rest of my life making it up to her. There is a distinct kind of intimacy that exists inside a car at night while it's raining. It's a confessional booth wrapped in leather and steel. I walked Clara to the valet stand, the adrenaline of the confrontation inside the ballroom slowly ebbing away, replaced by a hum of electricity that had nothing to do with business. The sky had opened up, a heavy, relentless downpour that blurred the city lights into streaks of gold and charcoal. "I'll call you a car," I had said, reaching for my phone. A reflex. The boss taking care of logistics. "No," she had answered, looking up at the rain. "You can drive me." It wasn't a question. It was a permission slip. Now we were sealed inside the cabin of my sedan. The outside world was reduced to the rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum of the wipers and the muted hiss of tires on wet pavement. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was thick. It was pressurized. I gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, my knuckles white. For the first time in years, I was hyper-aware of my own movements. I was aware of the heat radiating from the passenger seat. I was aware of the faint scent of her vanilla perfume mixing with the smell of damp wool, and the rich, earthy scent of the leather seats. I glanced over at her. She wasn't sitting like an employee anymore. There was no notepad, no rigid posture, no deferential nodding. She had kicked off her heels. Her head was tipped back against the headrest, her eyes closed, her face illuminated intermittently by the passing street lamps. She looked peaceful and beautifully, terrifyingly young. But not the kind of youth that implies naivety. The kind that implies possibility. "You drive slower than I expected," she murmured, her eyes still closed. A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "I'm carrying precious cargo." She turned her head, her eyes opening slowly. The playful remark hung in the air, changing shape, becoming something heavier. "Why did you do it, Clara?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. "After I humiliated you. After I threw you to the wolves. Why come back? Why save me?" The red light of a traffic signal bathed the interior in a crimson glow. I stopped the car. The engine idled, a low purr that vibrated through the floorboards. She looked at me, her gaze dissecting me with that same frightening intelligence she used on spreadsheets. "Because I wasn't saving the CEO," she said softly. "I was saving the man who taught me that details matter. And you missed a detail, Julian." "What detail?" "That I don't work for companies," she whispered, shifting slightly so her knee brushed against the center console, inches from my thigh. "I work for people. And I wasn't done working with you." The light turned green. I didn't move. In that pause, the corporate hierarchy that had stood between us like a fortress wall crumbled. I wasn't her boss. I was just a man in a suit, sitting next to a woman who had seen my worst failure and walked toward it instead of running away. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The air in the car felt suddenly thin, charged with oxygen and gravity. "I was wrong," I said, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. "I was arrogant. And I am." I paused, tightening my grip on the wheel to keep from reaching out to her. "I am profoundly sorry." She didn't say, "It's okay." She didn't let me off the hook. She just watched me, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips, as if she were reading a book she already knew the ending to. "Drive, Julian," she said softly. "We're not there yet." But as I eased the car back into motion, I knew she wasn't talking about her apartment. We arrived at her building, a pre-war brownstone with ivy climbing the brick facade, but I didn't unlock the doors. I turned the engine off. The sudden absence of the motor's hum left a ringing silence in the small space, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of the cooling metal and the soft rhythm of the rain tapering off against the roof. This was the moment. The threshold. The line in the sand. As a CEO, I knew exactly what the protocol was. You say goodnight. You wait until she is safely inside the lobby. You drive away. You go back to your penthouse, pour a scotch, and congratulate yourself on dodging a bullet. But as a man, I was paralyzed. I stared straight ahead through the windshield, watching a single droplet of water trace a path down the glass. I was acutely, painfully aware of the math. 46. 24. The 20 years of life, of cynicism, of mistakes that stood between us like a physical wall. I had suits older than her favorite songs. "You're doing it again," she said softly. I turned to look at her. She had shifted in her seat, her body angled toward me. In the half-light of the street lamp, her eyes were dark pools, unreadable and yet completely open. "Doing what?" I asked, my voice sounding rough in the quiet car. "Calculating the risk," she replied. A small, knowing smile played on her lips. "I can see the spreadsheet in your head, Julian. You're listing the reasons why you should unlock the door and drive away." "There are a lot of reasons, Clara," I said, and I meant it to sound firm, but it came out sounding like a confession. "I was your boss. I'm old enough to be." I couldn't finish the sentence. The cliché tasted like ash in my mouth. "To be what?" she challenged, her voice dropping to a whisper. She leaned in closer, just an inch, but it felt like miles. My mentor? My mistake? Or just a man who is terrified that he might actually feel something for the first time in a decade? I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. It was my anchor. If I let go, I didn't know what my hands would do. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. I wanted to trace the line of her jaw to see if she was real. The air in the car grew heavy, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't just attraction. It was recognition. She wasn't looking at my title. She wasn't looking at my wallet. She was looking at the cracks in my armor, and instead of using them to break me, she was trying to let the light in. "I'm not terrified," I lied. "Liar," she breathed. She didn't move away. She stayed right there in my space, forcing me to confront the heat radiating between us. The scent of vanilla was intoxicating now, heavier than the rain. "I saw you, Julian," she said, her voice steady and serious. "In that boardroom when everyone else saw a machine. I saw a man who was lonely. And tonight I don't see a boss. I just see you." My resolve fractured. The logical executive in my brain was screaming abort, but my heart, that traitorous dormant organ, was beating against my ribs like a prisoner demanding release. I took a breath, shaky and shallow. I turned fully toward her, letting go of the steering wheel. My hand hovered in the space between us, trembling slightly. "Clara," I whispered. "If we cross this line, there is no going back to the boardroom." She looked at my hand, then up at my eyes. "Good," she said. "Control is a muscle. If you flex it for 20 years without resting, it becomes hard. It becomes brittle. And when it finally snaps, it doesn't break clean, it shatters." I was still gripping the console, my knuckles white, fighting the last war of my logic against my instinct. I was listing the reasons why this was impossible: the age gap, the HR violation, the sheer terrifying reality of her brightness against my cynicism. Then she reached out. It wasn't a demanding gesture. It was a question asked in physical form. She placed her hand over my clenched fist. The shock of it nearly made me jump. Her palm was incredibly soft, warm and steady. My hand was twice the size of hers, weathered by stress and time, but under her touch, my grip on the console loosened. My fingers uncurled, almost against my will, until my palm lay open beneath hers. It was a surrender. The white flag was up. "Julian," she whispered. The sound of my name on her lips in the darkness of that car did something to my chest that no merger or acquisition ever could. It made my heart race, not with stress but with hope. I turned to her. The space between us, which had felt like a chasm earlier that evening, now felt like the center of the universe. I really looked at her. I saw the way her eyelashes caught the faint light from the dashboard. I saw the pulse fluttering wildly in the hollow of her throat, betraying her calm facade. She wasn't just outsmarting me now, she was waiting for me. Slowly, terrifyingly slowly, I raised my hand. I didn't reach for her waist. I didn't reach for her hand. I reached for her face. My fingers grazed her jawline, and I felt her breath hitch. A sharp, sudden intake of air that echoed loudly in the silence. The sound unraveled me completely. I cupped her cheek. Her skin was satin smooth, fever hot against my cool fingertips. I ran my thumb along the line of her cheekbone, tracing it as if I were memorizing a map I had been searching for my entire life. She leaned into my touch. She closed her eyes and tilted her head slightly, resting the full weight of her trust in my palm. It was a gesture of such profound vulnerability that it made my throat tight. "I can't be your boss anymore, Clara," I murmured, my voice barely a rasp. "I can't be your mentor. I can't be the man who tells you what to do." She opened her eyes. They were dark, dilated, and swimming with an emotion that looked dangerously like love. "Then don't be," she whispered. She turned her face into my hand, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the center of my palm. The sensation sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core, burning away the last remnants of the executive. The man who sat in that car wasn't a CEO. He was just a man who had finally found the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. I leaned in, closing the final inches between us, my forehead resting against hers. We breathed the same air, sharing the oxygen, existing in the heavy, beautiful pause before the inevitable. "I am entirely yours," I breathed against her skin. "And God help me, I think I have been since the moment I fired you." 6 months later. If you had told me a year ago that my Sunday evenings would look like this, I would have laughed you out of my office. Back then, Sunday nights were for dread. They were for scotch consumed in silence, staring at the skyline, bracing for the war of the coming week. Now, Sunday nights are my favorite time of the week. We were in my home library. The fire was lit, the birch logs crackling and popping, casting a warm dancing orange glow across the room. Outside, snow was falling, a soft, muted blanket that made the world feel quiet and far away. Inside, however, the air was alive. Clara was sitting on the rug in front of the coffee table, surrounded by a fortress of paperwork. She was wearing one of my old cashmere sweaters, the sleeves rolled up 3 times to fit her arms, and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. I stood by the window for a moment just watching her. She was muttering to herself, tapping a pen against her chin as she dissected the acquisition strategy for our new venture. Our venture. Not mine. I walked over to the sidebar and poured 2 drinks, a neat bourbon for me, and a sparkling water with a twist of lime for her. The crystal decanter felt heavy and solid in my hand, grounding. I walked over and sat down on the sofa behind her. Without looking up from the spreadsheet, she reached back, her hand seeking mine blindly until our fingers interlaced. "You're frowning," she said, still staring at the paper. "I can hear you frowning from here, Julian." I chuckled, a sound that came easily these days. "I'm not frowning. I'm admiring. Admiring the Q4 projections? Admiring the CEO," I corrected. She turned then, pulling the glasses off her face and looking up at me. The firelight caught the gold in her eyes. She looked tired but happy. The kind of deep, bone-deep satisfaction that comes from building something that belongs to you. "We're partners, remember?" she teased. 50-50. 60-40, I countered, handing her the glass. "You do 60% of the thinking. I just sign the checks and look intimidating in a suit." She laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to chase the shadows out of the corners of the room. She shifted, turning around to rest her back against the sofa, leaning her head against my knee. I rested my hand on her shoulder, my thumb brushing against the soft wool of the sweater. It was a simple touch, domestic and routine, but it carried more weight than any handshake I had ever made. In the business world, contracts are about protection. They are about clauses, exits, and liabilities. They are designed for the moment things go wrong. But looking down at her, I realized we had signed a different kind of contract that night in the car. It wasn't written on paper. It was written in the way she calmed my storms, and the way I grounded her lightning. It was a merger of 2 different timelines, 2 different generations finding a perfect, impossible rhythm. "You know," she said softly, closing her eyes as I massaged the tension from her neck. I'm glad you fired me. I paused. You are? She hummed. If you hadn't fired me, I would still be just an analyst. And you would still be just a boss. I leaned down, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, inhaling the scent of vanilla and wood smoke. Best executive decision I ever made, I whispered. She smiled, reaching up to squeeze my hand. The fire crackled. The snow fell. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the opening bell on Monday morning. I had already won the only deal that mattered. They say you should never mix business with pleasure. But sometimes the best partnerships are the ones you never saw coming. If Julian and Clara's story sparks something in you tonight, please press that like button. It helps this channel find its way to more listeners like you. And before you go, I have a question. In a relationship, do you prefer a partner who brings you peace? Or someone who challenges you to be better? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, stay warm.